It was a warm Friday evening in the small town of Riverdale. Cars buzzed along the main road, and the golden sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lieutenant James Carter, a proud officer in the United States Army, was on his way home from visiting his mother. He was still dressed in his sharp uniform, the shiny badges on his chest gleaming in the fading light. James was a kind man, always ready to help others. Everyone in his neighborhood knew him and respected him. But as he drove through a quiet street that evening, something happened that no one could have expected. James was driving his dark gray SUV when he noticed the flashing blue lights of a police car behind him. Confused but calm, he pulled over to the side of the road. He wasn't speeding, and his car was in perfect condition. What could be the problem? Maybe they just want to ask me something, James thought as he rolled down his window. The police officer, a tall man named Officer Bradley, stepped out of his patrol car. He placed his hand on his holstered gun as he approached James's car. James noticed this and felt his heart race a little, but he kept his cool. He had done nothing wrong. "License and registration," Officer Bradley said in a stern voice, peering into the car. His eyes flickered to James's uniform, but didn't linger long. James handed over his documents and said politely, "Good evening, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Instead of answering, Officer Bradley's expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. James's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked. "I said step out of the vehicle," Officer Bradley repeated, his voice louder this time. His hand moved to unclip his gun, and James felt a wave of fear wash over him. Why was this happening? Slowly and carefully, James opened his car door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. "Officer, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm happy to cooperate," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Suddenly, Officer Bradley drew his gun and pointed it at James. "Get on the ground," he barked. James froze. His heart pounded in his chest. "Sir, I'm an Army lieutenant," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no need for this." By now, a few people had stopped to see what was happening. A young boy on a bike, a woman walking her dog, and a man coming out of a nearby store all stared in shock. Whispers spread through the small crowd. "Isn't that Lieutenant Carter?" the woman asked. "He's such a nice man. Why is that officer pointing a gun at him?" James slowly lowered himself to his knees, his hands still raised. "Officer, please, let's talk this out. I don't want anyone to get hurt," he said. But before anything else could happen, something unexpected occurred. The young boy on the bike, about 10 years old, shouted, "Hey, that's Lieutenant Carter. He's a hero. Why are you doing this?" His voice was small but brave, and it carried through the air like a bell. Everyone turned to look at the boy. Even Officer Bradley hesitated for a moment, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. The crowd started to grow, and people began to record the scene on their phones. Just then, a second police car pulled up. Out stepped Officer Maria Lopez, one of the most respected officers in Riverdale. She quickly assessed the situation and recognized James immediately. "Bradley, lower your weapon," she commanded firmly as she approached. Her voice was authoritative, but there was a hint of urgency. Officer Bradley looked confused but didn't move. "He's acting suspicious," he muttered, keeping his gun pointed at James. "Suspicious? He's wearing an Army uniform, for heaven's sake," Maria snapped. She stepped between Bradley and James, her arms raised to de-escalate the tension. "Put the gun down now." The crowd murmured louder, their phones capturing every moment. The boy on the bike shouted again, "Listen to her!" He didn't do anything wrong. Officer Bradley hesitated, his face turning red with frustration. Slowly, he lowered his gun, but kept his hand near it, as if unsure of what to do next. Maria turned to James, her eyes apologetic. "Lieutenant Carter, are you all right?" she asked gently. James nodded, though his heart was still racing. "I'm fine, Officer Lopez. Thank you for stepping in." Maria turned back to Bradley, her expression hardening. "We'll talk about this later," she said in a low voice before addressing the crowd. "Everyone, please step back. We'll handle this." The situation seemed to calm down, but the air was still thick with tension. James remained kneeling, his hands still raised, as he waited for the officers to sort things out. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Maria leaned down to speak quietly to James. You don't have to stay like this anymore, Lieutenant. You're safe now. She extended her hand to help him up. James hesitated for a moment before taking her hand and standing. He brushed off his uniform, straightening his posture. Thank you, Maria, he said, his voice steady but tired. But this isn't over. The way he reacted, it wasn't right. Maria nodded solemnly. I'll make sure this is addressed. I promise you that. Before James could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. It was the boy on the bike, now standing with his arms crossed. Lieutenant Carter, are you okay? He asked. James turned to the boy and smiled, a small but genuine expression. I'm okay, kid. Thank you for speaking up back there. That took courage. The boy beamed, proud of his small but significant role in the unfolding events. Maria glanced at the boy, then back at James. We'll file a report and make sure this doesn't happen again. But for now, let's get you home safe, she said. James nodded but remained quiet, his thoughts heavy. The crowd's murmurs lingered in the background as the scene gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a shocking event. James climbed back into his SUV, his hands still trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that clung to him. In the rearview mirror, he could see the boy waving once more before pedaling off into the evening. As James pulled away from the scene, his thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, and a sense of determination. He couldn't let what happened go unnoticed. The uniform he wore was supposed to represent honor and integrity, and yet tonight, it felt like it painted a target on his back. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound accompanying him. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light flickered on, illuminating the small, neat house he'd worked so hard to maintain. Just as James stepped out of the car, his neighbor, Mr. Thompson, emerged from his porch. A retired Marine with a weathered face and kind eyes, Mr. Thompson had always looked out for James since he moved in. Evening, Lieutenant, Mr. Thompson called out, his voice warm but tinged with concern. As James stepped closer, the older man's smile faded. You all right, son? You look like you've had a rough night. James hesitated, his hand lingering on the car door. I'm fine, Mr. Thompson, he said, though his tone betrayed him. Just a long evening. Mr. Thompson studied him for a moment before nodding toward his house. Come on in for a coffee. You look like you could use someone to talk to. For a moment, James considered declining, but the weight of the evening pressed down on him, and he realized he didn't want to be alone with his thoughts. I'd like that, sir. Thank you, James said, offering a small smile. Together, the two men walked toward Mr. Thompson's porch, the cool evening air wrapping around them. As they stepped inside, James couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in the familiarity of the old Marine's home. It smelled of coffee and pine, and the walls were adorned with photos of Mr. Thompson's service days. James sat at Mr. Thompson's kitchen table, the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. As he recounted the events of the evening, Mr. Thompson listened intently, his weathered hands gripping his mug. When James finished, the older man leaned back in his chair, his expression both thoughtful and stern. You know, son, Mr. Thompson began, what happened to you tonight wasn't just wrong. It was a failure of what this country should stand for. But the way you handled yourself, staying calm and composed, that shows real strength. Now the question is, what are you going to do next? James nodded, the older man's words resonating with him. I can't let it slide, James said. Not just for me, but for others who might face the same thing. I need to speak up, report what happened, and push for accountability. Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. That's the spirit, Lieutenant. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you. The next day, James filed a formal complaint with the police department. The investigation into Officer Bradley's actions began, and James's story gained traction in the community. People rallied behind him, calling for better training and understanding among law enforcement officers. Officer Bradley was placed on administrative leave as the investigation unfolded. Throughout it all, James became a voice for justice and unity in Riverdale. He spoke at community meetings, schools, and even military events, sharing his story and urging others to stand against prejudice and fear. The boy on the bike, now a local hero in his own right, often joined James at these events, showing that even the smallest voices could make a big difference. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.